Hello, everybody. My name is Alana Crandall, and I am Manager of International Programs and Events at Global Ties San Francisco. Global Ties San Francisco is a division of World Trade Center Northern California and a member of the Global Ties US network. As a member of the Global Ties US network, we implement professional and diplomatic exchange programs in the San Francisco Bay Area. We are international exchange and public diplomacy professionals dedicated to building lasting relationships that lay the foundation for trust and collaboration. Integral to the success of our programs is an extensive and diverse network of regional business leaders, government officials, community-based organizations, home hospitality hosts, and local citizens. We are the only organization of our kind in the San Francisco Bay Area, serving all 9 counties, as well as Monterey, a little bit outside of the Bay Area. On an annual basis, we host over 700 international visitors to the Bay Area for these short-term professional and diplomatic exchanges, bringing approximately $1.1 million to the local economy. Through these visits, current and emerging foreign leaders exchange cutting-edge information with their professional counterparts, experience local culture, and cultivate lasting relationships with American citizens. We do all this and more. Please do stay in touch with us and see all that we do. I'll be putting our website link to the chat as well. But now I'll move on to who's joining us here today. First, we will start with our expert speaker, Ali Verji, who is a non-resident senior advisor to the Africa Center at the United States Institute of Peace. A little bit about the United States Institute of Peace, or USIP. This is a national nonpartisan independent institute founded by Congress and dedicated to the proposition that a world without violent conflict is possible, practical, and essential for US and global security. In conflict zones abroad, the Institute works with local partners to prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflict. To reduce future crises and the need for costly interventions, USIP works with governments and civil societies to build local capacities to manage conflict peacefully. A little bit about Ali. As I said, he's a non-resident senior advisor to the Africa program. While he was a visiting expert at USIP, he led research efforts in the Central African Republic, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and Sudan. In 2019, he received the Oslo Forum Peace Writer Prize for bold and innovative responses to today's peacemaking challenges for his work on reforming and innovating ceasefire monitoring. His entire bio is at a couple different places on the website for USIP, in the registration information, and in the follow-up information you have sent already. But if you would like me to put that into the chat as well, I'd be happy to do so. In addition, joining us here today is Debbie Raffel, who is the director of the San Francisco Department of the Environment. San Francisco Department of the Environment, or SF Environment, advances climate protection and enhances quality of life for all San Franciscans. SF Environment creates visionary policies and innovative programs that promote social equity, protect human health, and lead the way toward a sustainable future. Debbie, the director, believes that cities can take bold action to address environmental harm. A scientist by training and public servant by profession, Debbie has spent most of her career working in government to ensure that everyone has an equal right to a safe and healthy environment. As director, she leads the city's efforts to address climate change and build resilience. Under the leadership of Mayor London Breed and the Board of Supervisors, she helped pass one of the city's most groundbreaking bans on natural gas in new construction, implemented a new accelerated goal of carbon neutrality by 2040, and updated the city's climate action plan with collaboration from residents, CBOs, and businesses to include specific goals and strategies in the critical sectors of energy, transportation, materials, and biodiversity. named one of the world's 100 most influential people in climate policy. Thank you, Debbie, for joining us here today. And Ali, for you as well, thank you for joining us. You have a fantastic background as well, providing expert testimony before the High Court of Justice of England and Wales, the British Parliament, and the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Both of you, it is an honor to have you here. At this time, I'm going to pass the floor to Ali to get us started. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Alana. And thanks for everyone for coming to today's talk. But really, you might be wondering what this has to do with you. Does not Africa seem very distant to California? What can a country like the US really learn from the context and the problems of seemingly far, far away places? I want to argue today that there is relevance beyond some perhaps fuzzy sense of global connection or that we're all on the same planet. I want to suggest that perhaps there's relevance in at least three ways. First, that our problems are interconnected. And I don't just mean in terms of CO2 emissions or the general problem of climate change. As we'll see in a moment from some of the examples that we're going to go into, our consumption practices in the West have a direct result on what happens elsewhere. Second, I think there's relevance in early warning, that what happens elsewhere, even if it's far away, gives us an insight into what might happen in our own societies. Even if we think we might have more technological advantages or more financial advantages, more money, more capacity to address the problems that we face, we might need to be humble in terms of thinking about our own advantages and learn from what we can see going on elsewhere. And lastly, I think there's relevance in that learning, in thinking about what we can learn and seeing how other places deal with the same or similar challenges that we might face either now or in the future. So to make this a bit more tangible, I want to draw in my talk upon four different case studies, some which are a bit more positive and some perhaps less so, that illustrate these connections, that relevance, despite the distance. And these cases come from Ghana in West Africa, where we'll talk about textiles. They come from the Democratic Republic of Congo in the center of Africa, home to the second largest rainforest on Earth. Then we'll go to Kenya in the East Africa, and particularly to talk about the rise of avocado farming. And lastly, to the south of the continent, to cities in Southern Africa, South Africa specifically, and what they are doing or not doing to mitigate climate change. So our examples here draw from the four corners of the continent, and you can see them circled on the map there. So first to Ghana. Every week in Ghana, there are 15 million items of used clothing that arrive from Western countries. That's 780 million items of clothing a year. Sounds like a lot, right? To put that in perspective, that equates to the average number of garments purchased by about 13 million Americans every year. The average American buys about 59, 60 items of clothing every year. So what is arriving in Ghana is the annual purchases of about 13 million Americans. So I think that comes out to about a third of the population of California today. Now, the problem is that something like 40% of the clothes that arrive, these used clothes, are unusable, unsellable. They're broken. They're in poor condition. Nobody wants them. So they end up in the landfill, or even worse, perhaps being burned. And most of that disposal happens within a week of those clothes arriving in the country. Ghana is literally choking with discarded clothes that they cannot use and they cannot get rid of. So when we put clothes in the donation bin, we think we're doing a good thing, but perhaps inadvertently, we are often just exporting our disposal problem elsewhere. We think we're doing good, but is our consumption instead driving an environmental crisis? Now, you might ask, what does this have to do with climate change? Where's the link there? Apart from the waste of resources, it takes about 700 gallons of water to make one t-shirt, one cotton t-shirt. Let's think about the unnecessary CO2 emissions that are being caused by incineration, as well as the larger environmental damage. Clearly, burning textiles is a bad thing, no matter where it happens. We're doing it in a place where it's particularly incapable of dealing with that additional waste. So there's a very clear export of emissions going on because we can't deal with our own refuse and discards. The second case, and I should say these cases are very brief and we'll have some chance to discuss them a bit more in the discussion, but just to paint a couple of snapshots now. The second case, is in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the geographic center of Africa, and home to the second largest rainforest on Earth. That's in the Congo Basin, most of which is in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or DR Congo. The Congo Basin, is about 500 million acres in size, so that makes it larger than Alaska. We hear about destruction in the Amazon, it's pretty well known, but the Congo rainforest is also under threat. And tropical forests are among the planet's most vulnerable ecosystems to climate change. Under a high emission scenario, the average temperature in the region could increase by as much as 2.5 degrees by 2050. But apart from the change in temperature, what's perhaps lesser known is that the Congo Basin, by some estimates, is bigger than the Amazon in terms of serving as a carbon sink. So as the forest shrinks, and as the capacity of the forest to absorb carbon and deal with these higher temperatures changes, so does the sequestration capacity of the forest. 80 million people also live in the Congo Basin. By comparison, there's about 30 million or so that live in the Amazon Basin. Now, of course, it's not a competition for which is biggest, who has more people, and so on. My point here is to say that the stress on the population, on those people that live in and around the forest, in and around the basin, that those people who might be losing their livelihoods as the climate changes, puts pressure on the forest. And so the loss of the forest, deforestation, converting its use to other purposes, primarily grazing of animals, other agricultural production, for example, the loss of the forest then puts pressure on the asset, on an asset of the planet that we simply cannot replace. And so there's a consequence to what happens when the population that lives around there is stressed, as well as to the forest itself. The third case I want to quickly draw upon comes from Kenya in East Africa, and this is perhaps more of a mixed picture story in terms of both positives and negatives. I want to talk specifically about the rise of avocado farming, and that's boomed in Kenya over the last 10 years or so as part of a global boom in which the US is also playing a big part. I know the Super Bowl just happened, and while I don't have the stats for this year, I can tell you that in 2019, there were 67 million tons of avocados consumed on Super Bowl Sunday, sorry. So annual US consumption of avocados is something like 11 pounds per person per year. Avocados as a crop are fairly resilient to the effects of climate change. So a lot of Kenyan farmers are now favoring them because they can produce even in poor growing weather, even if there's erratic rainfall, even as there are sharp changes in temperature. So in one sense, you might think, oh, well, this is good. This is crop diversification. It's providing small farmers with a more reliable income. This global boom and demand for avocados, which is not, of course, only in the US, but also in Europe, elsewhere, is something which Kenyan farmers can use to pull themselves up in terms of the incomes they have and reduce their vulnerability to other shocks to agricultural production. However, as temperatures rise, there is another pest to confront, the fruit fly. And the fruit fly has become a lot more common in Kenya. And guess what? Fruit flies love eating avocados. So the same farmers who were looking to diversify their crops because of other climatic factors like changes in rainfall, more erratic temperatures that crops don't like, these sudden changes between cold and hot, are finding that after a few years, warmer temperatures overall are bringing another problem. So that crop diversification, that original idea, incentivized by a global demand for a superfood, ends up not necessarily leading to that diversification, or perhaps only temporarily to that diversification. And ultimately, that might mean that a lot more farmers will end up losing their shirts because they're plugged into this situation both at home, where there are specific environmental factors that might reduce the productivity of what they're growing, but also because they're much more vulnerable to global commodity prices. And as tastes change, or as demand might shift towards one type of avocado over another, or what have you, whatever they were growing before, and now they're gearing towards export of avocados, reduces their ability to have a sustainable livelihood as well, or at least potentially do so. So again, this connection, despite perhaps seemingly not having one. The last case study I want to talk about or touch on briefly comes to the municipal level, to cities in South Africa and what they're doing to mitigate climate change. South African cities were among the first to recognize climate change in the continent in terms of it being an issue to deal with. Take Cape Town, for example, in South Africa. Cape Town was the first city in South Africa to adopt an integrated metropolitan environmental plan, that's what they call it, in 2001, and a framework for adaptation to climate change in 2006. Of course, there are many cities, even in the developed world, which still don't have very thorough plans. So in that sense, there were early adopters of this idea that, we can't just keep doing the same things as we were doing before. But at the same time, Cape Town and other South African cities are cities that are marked by extreme inequality between rich and poor, extreme differences in terms of livelihoods, in terms of what people do, employment, what people do in terms of the opportunities that they have, educational, social, and so on. The abilities or the difference that people may have in terms of what housing they have, what sanitation they have. And so there was, at the same time as having this kind of plan in place, much of a concern about saying, well, we know that there's something down the road that we might need to prepare for, but how can we justify the allocation of scarce financial resources to unknown future events that might or may not materialize? That was the thinking if we go back, say, 10, 15 years ago. However, one of those seemingly unforeseeable or unforeseen events did, in fact, materialize. In 2017, there was a water crisis in Cape Town. In part, this was precipitated by drought. Others would say that there was also a general water mismanagement problem over the years. I'm not a water scientist, so I don't want to say which was the case. There certainly was a drought, a prolonged drought over a couple of years. There certainly were mismanagement issues as well. But the ultimate consequence was that people said, aha, climate change. Look, we have water stress. We can't support our municipal usage of water at the same rate. It's unsustainable. We can't use as much water as we have been for both domestic household use, as well as for agricultural production, as well as for industrial production. So we need to change. We need to cut back. And there was a lot of focus on the emergency, on the crisis response. But what I want to bring up here today is not so much the fact that there was a water crisis, but more of the economic side of this issue that perhaps is less thought about and is less indicative or is less recognized, but I think is perhaps more indicative of what we could learn from the Cape Town experience in other cities. Now, Cape Town has a system where water is metered, but also it is step tariffed. So that means that the initial usage, people who use the least amount of water, pay a fairly small amount for their overall usage. In fact, everyone pays a small amount for the first however many liters of usage there is. And then as you progressively use more and more water, you pay more and more. So it's a stepped tariff. And what happened during this water crisis in Cape Town was that people were told, everybody was told, you've got to stop consuming, got to use less water. And consumption did, in fact, fall among all consumers. Everybody stopped using more water. And that sharp drop, in fact, materialized much more among wealthier, high-volume consumers who were using more water to begin with. And one of the consequences of that for the city economically was that high demand, that high volume usage amongst wealthier consumers was helping to subsidize that lower cost per unit to be charged to more poorer users that were using lower amounts of water, because the effective cost of producing a unit of clean water is the same no matter whether it's the first or the 100th. But the fact that higher price was being charged for that 100th unit allowed the water utility to maintain this lower step tariff for the people using the least water. And so the cross-subsidization model, which provided the economic logic to how water could be used and managed in the city, was breaking down, because that sharp, unplanned reduction of usage among consumers who were subsidizing others meant that all of a sudden the water utility was in a financial crisis. And so the consequence of that was to say, okay, we're going to have to raise the step tariff, the lowest step for everybody. In a situation, in a country, in a city where there are a lot of poor people, where there are a lot of people who can't afford a very large increase in their utility bills, this became a very difficult problem. So people who had a middle-class income or a higher income, if the water price went up, it didn't really affect them very much. People at the lower end of the scale, the water price going up, even if they weren't using a great deal of water, had a much more significant effect. And so I bring up this case to illustrate that there is a challenge here in terms of how water governance happens. We might think the simple solution is just to say, well, consumption needs to fall. We can't use water at the rates we are. But there are also consequences to how that then plays out in the real world, and how the city, in this case, manages that problem, both from a climate perspective, because, of course, sustaining that reduced consumption is important in the longer term, reducing wastage and so on, so that there isn't a recurrence of this kind of problem. At the same time, there's a social equity dimension to this water issue too. So what I want to conclude with here from these 4 case studies is 2 wider takeaways, and we'll come back to the specifics of the case studies perhaps in a moment. And those 2 wider takeaways are that climate change does not look like one thing across Africa. It looks like lots of different things. Even if we think there's a generalized picture, it isn't necessarily the case. The second, and this is to come back to the point I made at the outset about what is the wider relevance of the case, that what happens in Africa does matter elsewhere. Even if I haven't convinced you by these connections, let me try and convince you by sheer demography. That by 2050, 1 in 4 people will live in Africa worldwide, and that the practices of those 1 in 4 will affect the rest of us, whether we like it or not. So today, there's perhaps only 1 in 7 of the people on the planet live in Africa, and that demographic boom is still going to come over the same period that we are confronting elsewhere these climate challenges. So I'll leave it there for now. Thanks, Alana, again, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Ali, for that. Wow, as a person who lives and works in what we call the bubble inside the bubble, San Francisco is the bubble inside the bubble being California, and the Bay Area being the bubble inside that bubble. I think it's so important for cities like San Francisco and for the people who are outside of Africa to hear your message, Ali, and to hear I mean, what struck me was the amazing similarities of your stories. When you were describing the water situation in Cape Town and the relative tariffs and what happens when everybody all of a sudden um, conserves and then the revenues go down and the stress that puts on the system. Well, that's exactly what happened last year here in San Francisco in the drought. We're the west of the United States is in its worst drought in 1,200 years. So yes, we have a lot to learn from the African cities. So when you think about that connection, what is it that you want? And you opened it up with these sort of three themes about that there's things we do here matter in Africa. Let's learn from each other. What do you think in the US, what is Africa trying to tell us as a country, for example, or Canada? What is it trying to tell the West in terms of what we need to pay attention to in terms of what's going on the continent?
Thanks, Debbie. I mean, I think that's a very simple answer. If you ask Ghanaians who are in the municipal government in Accra, the capital of Ghana, they're saying, "Stop sending us your garbage. Stop sending us your rubbish." There's a very clear message there. Of course, that's a micro level thing. I think others would say, if we would take the leaders in Cape Town, they would say, "Hey, we had this situation years before you did. Even if your drought has been going on for a long time, we had to deal with this, and we put people who were poor out of reach of the water system. We denied that sort of universal provision, even though we really wanted to maintain it." But I think beyond the sort of cases, there's also a wider concern, a wider message about saying we're in this together.
Yes.
People in the Congo, for example, recognize the rainforest is important. They know it's important. It has sustained them and their families and their ancestors. They have that sense that it has value, and they have that sense it has value beyond their immediate family situations, because they also know just how much interest and how many people are involved in sort of looking to exploit the resources of the Congo Basin, whether the minerals, whether the forest products, and so on. So it's not that there is a denial or even a lack of desire to protect the ecological advantages of the continent, but at the same time, the vulnerabilities that are caused are not necessarily driven by the people that live there. They're driven by other forces. So the demand for minerals in the Congo, for coltan, for example, is to create cell phones that we use, right? To create computers that we use. That's where this demand for these minerals comes from. And so people recognize that these things are connected and say, yeah, we're happy to mine this stuff and we want to earn an income from it. We want a livelihood from it. At the same time, we want to do it in a way that protects our environment and the place that we live. So I think there are messages happening at different levels here, but there is a very clear message about the fact that just because it happens far, far away, it doesn't mean that you don't have a part to play in it.
When I hear you talk, I just think about the voracious appetite of consumption in this country and other Western nations. And some of it's a paradox, right? We think we're doing things for the environment. We're recycling our clothes. We are using electric batteries more, but all of those have life cycle impacts. So, clearly this is an international challenge because we're all connected, as you say. And so the international body is the UN. And the UN has these meetings called Conference of the Parties, the COPs. And at those COPs, it feels like I keep hearing from the Global South nations, look, you need to help us with funding. You need to invest in our solutions. And frankly, I'm not sure that the West has been that receptive to that. When you listen to those conversations, what comes up for you? With your experience being on the ground in Africa and then listening to what's happening in Glasgow, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I have two reactions. The first is that when countries say, we need to have money in order to mitigate these challenges, it's not an exaggeration. They do. Of course, on the other hand, when donor countries in particular are worried about whether that money will be used well, whether it will be used effectively, whether it will be diverted to corruption and so on, those are also valid concerns. But I would say that at the same time as that state to state level discussion continues, because the wheels of state diplomacy turn very slowly, and a pledge of $100 billion or whatever it ends up being doesn't necessarily mean that there's $100 billion of available money, let alone $100 billion of actual projects or actual mitigation efforts. I would point to the many individual things that we can do that don't have necessarily huge financial impact. So to take this example of getting rid of our used clothing that we don't want anymore, I mean, the cost to us to dispose of those things is basically nothing, right? And so we give it away, we throw it away. Maybe we pay something if there's a municipal fee to dispose of something, but it's a pretty minimal cost, right? And that financial cost doesn't get recognized. That burden that we're transferring for waste disposal isn't counted. Nobody says, well, that's the actual economic cost to recycle or to dispose of this or that product. And I think when it comes to plastics, for example, we're much more sort of cognizant of the fact that exporting our plastics to wherever else in the world to be disposed of isn't a sustainable solution. But I don't think we've caught on to how that works with other products that we don't see as waste necessarily. We still attach value to them, and we think someone else might value them. And that's something I would say that, as much as the next COP, whenever it's going to be in 5 years' time, will have to deal with the same issues that this one faced. Maybe the global situation will only have got worse by then. Maybe the urgency will have increased. But the many challenges that African states face in terms of their own governance capacity probably won't have changed that much. So I think in a way it's about having more than one approach. Yes, it's certainly the case that if we don't pay now, we're going to pay more later. Debbie, how much it costs to plan, for example, flood mitigation measures in coastal cities, or to deal with erosion. These things are really expensive, right? And they're particularly expensive in expensive real estate. Why wouldn't we invest in doing that in places where the property costs are lower, the benefit might be greater? To me, there's a value in saying, yes, we might do this in a city like San Francisco or a city like Miami or wherever, but also doing it in places where the benefit is going to provide much more to us, both as a planet, but also to the people that live there. At the same time, we can also look at what we can do while our governments at the national level move more slowly.
Yeah. Wow. There's so much that came up for me. I mean, everything from this idea of what happened with plastics. A big part of that was that China said no more. They basically said, you know what? Their national sword policy, we are not going to accept it anymore. Don't ship it. And that was a huge wake up call. And of course, countries like Ghana could turn off the spigot to us too. As you say, 40% is useless. 60% has some value. I'm wondering if there's some other harms in this, even if we think about that 60%. Anyway, let's come back to that. I want to come back to the clothing, but I want to switch now and think about some of the natural ecosystems impacts, things like the avocado, because that's such an interesting dilemma, because at one level, and many of these things are tensions, right? They start off with, we want to help, or this is good for the local economy, diversification of crops, feeding, the market, supply and demand. You talk about true cost, and I'm just thinking about true costs of food. And right now, the avocado is an awesome example because the United States or California just actually the US said no more avocados are going to come in from Mexico because of some safety issues for inspectors. So now the pressure is going to be even more on places like Ghana to give us their avocados. So, oh, not Ghana, I'm sorry, it was Kenya that was
Kenya,
doing
yeah.
the avocados. So how do we work with the Kenyans to support local agriculture and help them financially without destroying them by just making them a monoculture of avocado growing for us? What can we do here? Is there anything?
I mean, I think there's a couple of things. One is that, we don't always think about the environmental cost of the food that we buy and the food that we consume. I mean, now, of course, there's more of a movement to buy local and buy organic, and people think about these things to an extent.
Right.
But as you say, from a California perspective, Mexico is not that far away distance wise. And if there aren't Mexican avocados, then people are looking further afield. And so perhaps the distance consideration becomes, well, I'd like to buy something that's closer, but there isn't. And so I don't think that's enough. But I think one of the things for us to think about is not only the question of distance, because that often is related to transport and sort of the cost of bringing something and the miles that it takes to transport a given product, but also the ecological cost of producing a crop on the other side of the world. We are, in effect, in importing fruits and vegetables and other food, also importing water that's been used or that came from somewhere else, and we don't return it, right? I mean, even if we compost our avocado skins and the water is staying here and the place that it's being consumed. So I think one thing, sort of the missing dimension of sustainable consumption, because I don't want to tell people, well, you can't have avocados anymore, but I think what's missing from that is still a level of information. If we look at sort of the transitions over the last couple of decades, we've gone from having no information about the nutritional content of a particular food or its additives to having all of that information, right? How many calories are in it, how much sugar is in it, how much fat is in it, etc. And these things we know. We know to an extent about the place of origin of a particular vegetable, let's keep it simple with the fruit and veg. But we don't have a sense of that ecological cost. That is it actually sound to have an avocado produced in Kenya where they use X number of gallons per year to produce that avocado compared to somewhere else? So, I mean, this doesn't necessarily directly respond to your question about monoculture, but I think it's more about environmental sustainability and responsibility as consumers. But I do think that part of the second aspect, which is connected to this in terms of what consumers can do or should do, is also think about what we do with sort of the exporters and the importers who basically control this, right? The individual farmer has to go through many, many middlemen before that avocado will appear on some shelf in a supermarket in California. And there, we need to be demanding more in terms of the same thing that's happened with tea and coffee and chocolate, for example. I mean, the fair trade work isn't perfect, and there are lots of problems with those certification measures as well. But I think just because we have focused, or just because that movement has focused on a few particular commodities, there's much more opportunity to demand that to be the case elsewhere, right? I mean, this happened with bananas, for example, from Central America. That is a much more established and accepted practice, but I don't think it's really established when it comes to most other crops. And I think as consumers, that's something that we can demand or demand more of.
That's a perfect example. The banana example is really good in terms of consumers saying, we want these labelings, we want these certification, we want to understand and be able to make choices and use our market power to do good rather than to destroy. So there's a whole bunch of questions now, and I'm from the people in the audience. And so I want to, even though I could keep going, So one attendee asked, this is interesting, could you briefly speak to how these issues link to the conflict work of your organization, USIP? You have many hats that you wear, Ali. So how does this climate change work and these concerns link to that aspect of USIP?
Yeah, I mean, the reason I chose these examples today to deliberately stay away from conflict with a capital C, if I can call it that, is because in a way, conflict and environmental concerns, environmental drivers of conflict, I think are more than about the visible manifestations of war or fighting that we might see. That it's also about the environmental stress that societies are placed on. That a country like Ghana, for example, is very successful. You know, it's a democratic country, it's a stable democratic country, it's a growing economy, etc. But its environmental problems will contribute to economic problems, and that might weaken the resilience of the society. Other countries, other examples, I mean, the Congo, for example, is not a very well-governed democratic country. It's got lots of problems. And so there, the risk and the potential for breakdown as a result of ecological breakdown, accompanied by a lot of other things, is much greater. And so conflict is, yes, and for USIP certainly very importantly, about active violence where there are disputes between states or within states. We're very concerned about that. But I think one of our additional concerns is that there are environmental drivers of conflict too, and some of those are quite subtle. That it's not only about saying that there was a fall in rainfall which caused people to move and therefore run into conflict with their neighbors. Yes, that exists too. But I think we're also suggesting and saying that, you know, we've got to think about the long-term implications of how climate could drive conflict or make populations more vulnerable to conflict too. So it operates at both the level of what's going on today, but also what may happen in the future.
I love how you use the word resilience to talk about resilience of democratic structures or governing structures. I think here in the US, we think a lot about resilience as sort of more resilience of communities to the effects of climate change. And what you're saying that in countries where there is more delicacy or consequence of error, if you will, there's this lack of resilience in terms of governance that climate change would exacerbate. And that's such a interesting connection. Okay, I'm going to switch from sort of that global down to the individual level now. An attendee asks, I've donated clothes. Before I do this, should I ask the organization some questions such as, what do they do with the clothing? How do they determine if the clothing is sufficient quality and appropriate for the climate for which it's being sent? That's a really interesting point. And if the color style would be culturally appropriate, what would be the right questions to ask, if any?
I think this is a very good point, and you know, by no means do I want to discourage people from not being charitable and saying, well, the solution is to throw away clothes. I mean, you wouldn't be happy with that, Debbie, if people started throwing more textiles into the waste system in San Francisco or any of the cities in the Bay Area. But I do think we do need to ask more about this sort of supply chain, that we should consider it a supply chain, right? In the same way that we are concerned about where our food comes from, if it's ethically sourced, if it has pesticides, et cetera, we also need to be responsible when we are the producers. In this case, we are producing the used clothes and we're saying, okay, I'm sending it off in the next chain. And so, yeah, I think the first questions that this respondent, this attendee is raising about what the organization does with the clothing is really important. You know, the question about sort of cultural appropriateness and colors and so on, I think in some sense there's always going to be an issue there, but I don't see those things necessarily as the primary issues environmentally, right? The thing that the textile traders in Ghana say is that, you know, we're happy to have high quality clothing. There's a market for it. It also you know, creates livelihoods for people here. It's not that they don't want used clothing, but there is a question here about, you know, how appropriate it is to send stuff which we wouldn't use, we wouldn't consider it usable here. And so that, I think, is where we also need to decide before we put something in the box or the bin, whether it's really usable to begin with. And if it isn't, then the question becomes, what options do we have for textile recycling here at home? And I know that this varies considerably. There are some cities and some states that do and some that don't, but there I think we can also demand that that's happening, because textile waste is a big contributor to the waste stream, and some places are just not addressing it. And so I think that's also part of what we need to ask. It's not only the charities that we give stuff to, but it's also our own cities and our own responsible authorities who have a role to play here too.
I actually think that's an outstanding point. That, and that's what I kept thinking about. Is I think about Goodwill. In the United States, they're a really wonderful organization, and they do sort to look at what's useful. But what do they do with the stuff that has no place to go? We in San Francisco are really struggling with that. What do we do with unusable textiles? So this is a problem, and this is a problem we need, frankly, a lot more attention to. Plastics is important, yes. Glass is important. Textiles, that is an issue that I think has been a little bit sleepy, and I really appreciate the way you've brought it to our attention. Okay, I'm going to switch gears. Here in California, we're experiencing the devastating effects of wildfires that we have increasingly been seeing in the last 5 years. Are there any regions throughout Africa that are experiencing other natural disasters, aside from the drought example that you highlighted, that are sparking action to combat climate change? How much are folks in Africa linking climate change to natural disasters, and what's really motivating people to take action?
There's some very good examples from the east coast of Africa, from Mozambique, from Madagascar, which have been hit by some once-in-a-century storms, except the problem was that they were hit by these once-in-a-century storms 2 or 3 years running. And so much like what goes on with the hurricanes in the Caribbean and saying these massive Category 5 storms, the same sorts of thing saying, hey, we never used to have storms like that. What's going on? I think one thing people have recognized is how deforestation contributes to limiting the ability of communities to respond and to withstand those terrible storms that come. If the trees are all gone, of course, the earth just disappears. But at the same time, warming seas and stronger climates are not just a matter of having left your trees in the ground. And so there is, at some level, concern, and that has motivated people to respond. But I also think there's a lot of people who feel that it's bigger than them, that it's almost overwhelming. What can we do? If there was a storm last year that we'd never seen before in terms of its size and ferocity, and now this year we have the same thing, what can we do? And it's very easy for people to fall into despair or hopelessness about it. But at the same time, I think there's recognition that these things are connected, because people are also aware that these things are happening elsewhere in the world. They can see the same kind of massive typhoons that are hitting Japan that haven't hit Japan before, or the same hurricanes that now travel all the way up the Atlantic coast when they really didn't go as far before, etc. So in that sense, there's also, I think, opportunity for global solidarity, that people who recognize that they live in very different contexts but face the same sort of challenges also have a point of possible unity.
Gotta get myself off mute. Okay, you teed me up exactly for the question I wanna end with, which is, you talked about the problem of going into hopelessness. It's easy to look at the devastation, the lack of resilience, and just say, it's too big. It doesn't matter what I do. So you, Ali, you are a student of the whole planet. What gives you hope? What gives you hope these days?
I think the fact that there are so many people who do still want to make a difference, and that they are not lost in the sense that their individual contribution is meaningless, that as we reflect on what we can do as individuals, we also should reflect on the incremental accumulation of those efforts, right? I mean, if we believe that breaking the rules or not changing our behavior has no impact, then having any kind of measure, having even the high occupancy vehicle on the freeway, say, well, it's okay if I don't have another person in my car, I can break it. If the fact is, we do see the effects of individual actions, particularly individual negative actions. And so what gives me hope is to see that actually people do believe that it's worth continuing to make an effort and to think about how to change behavior, because some of these things we don't think we're necessarily doing anything wrong. We don't have malice. We don't have negative intent. Sometimes we do, perhaps, but I think a lot of the time we just don't know what our alternatives might be or how we could even imagine new alternatives. And I think as long as we are asking that question about what we can do and how we can do things differently, there is certainly good reason to maintain at least some hope.
Yeah, let's take off blinders. Let's ask the question, look around, learn from each other, connect with each other, and that will give us hope. That's a beautiful way to end this. Thank you, Ali. And over to you, Ilana.
Thank you so much, Debbie. Thank you both. It has been a fantastic conversation. I don't want to say I'm surprised, but I'm a little surprised that we are already at time, but it just flew by. This was a really engaging conversation. I do want to say a big thank you to all of our attendees for joining today's session on climate change in Africa and its local and global implications. We hope that you enjoyed today's session, that you learned something new, and that you'd like to tune in the next time. Big thank you to Ali and Debbie for your time here today. It really has been an honor to work with both of you. You both are fantastic individuals and doing really great work. To everybody, we did receive way more questions than we could have possibly addressed, but thank you for your active participation. We truly do appreciate it. Thank you for joining us here today. Have a great rest of the day, everybody. Thank you so much.